Hi there, my name's Ange. Welcome to episode 3 of my bikepacking ride on the Altravesur route, which runs from Cadiz on Spain's Atlantic coast to Valencia on the Med. Episode 1 covered riding from Cadiz to Ronda, episode 2 went on to Niguelas. Episode 3. Niguelas to La Calahorra, Spain. Bikepacking the Altravesur route in Spain, written sometimes on the route, and edited after the ride, by Angela Hart. Being a rookie bikepacker, I have a lot to learn. But you need to practice what you preach. I know I should be getting up early and riding in the cooler hours, passing through a town if necessary around midday, then riding off again and stopping for a siesta until the day cools a little, then riding again in the evening. I know this. But I just can't do it. I'm hopeless. It's a downward spiral, as the more I suffer from heat exhaustion, the later I get up each day, and the more I end up riding in the heat of the day. The Sierra Nevada mountain range runs west to east in the bottom right-hand corner of Spain, around 40 kilometers from Spain's Mediterranean coastline. We pick up here as I leave Niguelas, taking my first steps onto the Sierra. El Secreto de Olivo Hotel in Niguelas. Price includes breakfast. I only had a couple of slices of toast, so thought it would be okay to nick a couple of pieces of fruit for later. At breakfast there was a group of around 8 guys from the UK that were on a road cycling holiday, based at the hotel, going for different rides each day. There was more in their group, 17 in total, the others staying at a rented villa, a pretty big group. It was my earliest start riding to date, well except for the necessary early rise after the El Burgo fiasco. 8 a.m. and there was no problems with getting lost. It was a steep ride down out of town, across the riverbed, then steeply up onto the Camino. I could see the mountain I needed to cross. It looked quite daunting, and I knew this was the lower of the two I'd need to cross to get to my destination of Two.Pampaneira. The Camino was at first surfaced. It was much steeper than other Caminos for the first 2 kilometers or so, then it became a little easier, but was always up. The road was not only steep but switchbacked as well, so it seemed lots of pushing, but I soon had climbed much higher than Niguelas and I started checking the altitude on my map to try and encourage myself or will myself up to the 1900 meters. I decided I needed to control my hydration and nutrition better, to stop this continual cycle of dehydration and sunstroke. I vowed to stop every hour for 10 minutes to refuel and cool down. This lasted once, at 9:15, where I stopped at what would have been the most fabulous wild camping spot. The next stop was 11:30 and then God knows when. That didn't last long, did it? The scenery was pretty, rugged and green with trees, shrubs and flowers, interspersed with rocky outcrops. And soon mountains in all directions, with a large plain beyond Niguelas and some distance to the mountains in that direction. Pushing. At 1,500 meters someone had claimed a parcel of land and had built a cortico and fenced his parcel off meticulously. It was a beautiful location, looking down over the towns on the valley floor, and up at the higher mountains. Strangely, his house had a pitched roof. Usually they are of flat roofs. At 1,700 meters I came across a welcome fuente, where I replenished my water, not bothering to filter it at this altitude. Although really I should, as later I'd stop at a waterfall where there was cow poo in the stream, and this was around the same altitude, so it's not always safe. In fact, I drink out of the town fuentes without filtering, and realize I probably shouldn't. So I'd ridden up the mountain visible from Niguelas, to 1,200 meters, then along the ridgeline of the higher peak behind it to around 1,400 meters, then down 100 meters, then back up to 1,700. This dirt Camino runs around the edge of the Sierra Nevada. On the map it looks like it goes up and down, when in fact, because each hill or hump of the mountain sticks out, you are running quite level, perhaps falling and rising a couple of 100 meters in elevation once you've done the big push up to it. It's a nice ride, very hot in the sun with little shade, but it has some fabulous views. I'm not sure I went the right way at a junction. It kind of forks off. I took the left fork but think I should have taken the right. They end up in the same place though. The route goes down to a river valley. The gravel Camino gives way to a grassy, little-used Camino that is quite steep and good fun. I was running out of brakes on this section. It was pretty fast. The Camino suddenly ends and becomes a grassy meadow. I had obviously missed my turning. I had lost my Google Maps and hence the Altravesur route, so I had no idea where to go. I had started to go down through the meadow and realized this isn't a trail. I decided to retrace my steps, coming to a steep, rocky, switchbacked single track on my right. The signpost indicated it wasn't suitable for bikes. This was some sort of walking route and it seemed to incorporate what I thought was a cycling route, named Circuit de Teo. All a bit confusing. I notice on the map that there is a refugio down in this river valley. What a shame I didn't find that. I seriously need to get better at looking at the map and planning. I made my way down this trail to the fast-running mountain river, Rio Lanaron I believe, where I replenished my water again. There are signposts to Teo, which I think must have been a smattering of random houses over quite a large area. Pushing back up from the ravine I found some signposts, but none were listing the direction I thought I needed to go. I kept going the way I thought and found a GR7 post, which after some time led to a Camino. This Camino continues up to 1,900 meters, then continues to run along the side of the mountain, sometimes on the level, sometimes uphill but never a good downhill. I was exhausted, it was getting on for 7 p.m. by now. Water wasn't a problem, there was access to many acequias. I'd met a couple of young German hikers in Niguelas the night before, and met them again on this Camino. They were setting up camp in what they thought was the garden of an empty forester's house. They invited me to camp there too, but I didn't fancy it. It didn't look abandoned and I didn't want waking up in the night to get thrown off the land. I can't find it on the map, so still have no idea what the building was, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a refuge. I continued on, stopping for kilometers farther on, at a recreation area, but the trees were so thick and tall that no light was getting through. There were some abandoned buildings there, a cafe and toilets in fact. I continued on about a kilometer or so and saw down a turning to my right, what looked like an abandoned nave. The grass was grown up around it, and around the doors. I deliberated as to whether I should camp there. It was 7:30 by now. I'd traveled around 40 kilometers and I was exhausted. So I decided, yes. There was water close by, which was a bonus. I had a great night's sleep, and wasn't disturbed at all. I didn't hear or see anything or anyone. On Tuesday morning, after some breakfast, I packed up and set off. From here it was all downhill on a gravel Camino. I rode the Camino, fast downhill, all the way to the main mountain road. I love these Camino downhills, they are bumpy and twisty, and usually running along the side of the mountain with a huge drop down to one side. When I got to the road, I checked my map and I realized I should have turned off around half a kilometer back, damn it. So I spent half an hour pushing back up, now in the hot sunshine, and took the turning I missed. It was chained off, but loose enough to lift the chain over the bike. Meta and Robert, who had ridden through here the week previous, had said there was a turning not to take. Of course I forgot about this. I continued along the track. There was a shack on the right with a lot of litter, and around 6 cats which scarpered as I rode near. Eventually the double track peters out to single track, then just grass. That's when I remembered what Robert had said. This was what he was talking about. He had said take the main road as this was just grassland and difficult to traverse. Damn it again. No matter, it had been all uphill from the road to the Camino, and from the Camino to this track, so it didn't take long to whiz back down and was a good ride. I turned left onto the mountain road, heading for Pampaneira that I could see high up to my right across a ravine, so I knew it would be quite a climb. On arriving in the town, I saw an inviting-looking restaurant. As I drank my Coke I noticed that it was also a hostel. Although only around midday I decided to inquire if I could stay there as I needed to restock my camping provisions. It was a little more expensive than I wanted, nevertheless I booked the room which was immediately vacant. I set about doing my washing, hanging my clothes from my bungees across the window shutters. I went off to explore the town and get my shopping. only to discover there wasn't a supermarket of any sort in Pampaneira. The most they had was a panaderia that had some essentials, alas no camp-friendly foods. I decided I needed to protect myself from the blazing sun better, so went looking for a more suitable hat than a baseball cap, eventually settling on a Panama hat that actually fitted me. I have terrible problems with hats, I have a stupidly small head. But this was perfect. I also bought some myrrh incense sticks to use in my tent, as Robert and Meta had said there was quite a lot of mozzies in the Sierra Nevada. So, I'd have to get the bus to the higher villages of Capoeira or Trevelez to get my shopping, but the daily bus had already gone, so I decided to book the room for the next night too, which would give me all day tomorrow to get the bus. Bay was only allowed in the restaurant, not my room, so I locked him to the radiator and hoped for the best. Pampaneira, along with Bubion, Capoeira, and Trevelez are popular towns for tourists. Coachloads of them are dropped off in the pueblos each day. These tourists are the main source of income here, with many shops selling souvenirs, trinkets, and local produce, along with many cafe bars and restaurants. These are also popular towns in which to base a hiking or biking holiday. I had an embarrassing moment when I returned to my room after my attempt at shopping. I noticed my SpongeBob cycling pants had fallen off my bungee. Being on the first floor, I couldn't retrieve them, so I went outside to see if I could get them, but they had fallen into a narrow drainage alleyway that was fenced off. I told the grumpy waiter what had happened, and he was less grumpy at sorting this out. He got a man from the bar to climb over the high railings to retrieve my sopping wet pants. When I say grumpy waiter, I mean the one that waits the tables a little later in the day. The man that's there early is really friendly and kind. This other guy just seems bad-tempered, and not just with me. I had a rough idea where the bus stop was, but on getting there a man told me the bus stopped way up the hill. I thought, damn, I'm going to miss it at this rate, so rushed up the hill, only to be told it was where I thought it was in the first place. I was getting hot and bothered by now, but made it back to the bus stop in time. Opposite the bus stop was a coach park, yes, a coach park in this tiny pueblo, and 4 coaches were parked up after dropping off the tourists, some Spanish and some French. You can imagine how busy the town gets. It's impossible to take a nice photo, there's too many people around. Whilst at the bus stop, a young guy came riding by with luggage on his bike, so I stopped him and asked him about his route. He was from Dublin, I forget where he flew into, but he was heading for Almeria Airport where he had a flight booked. His riding was on the road, not on the caminos, so a different route to me. I should have just got the bus to the next village of Bubion, as they have all that I need, but I decided that I may as well go to Trevelez as it was bigger and assumed therefore it would be better. This was a mistake. The road to the other villages climbed steeply out of Pampaneira, but in no time we was in Bubion. Then on to Capoeira. Once in Capoeira the bus turns around and goes all the way back, as Capoeira is up a dead end. Then it goes on to Trevelez, reputed to be the highest town in mainland Spain at nearly 1,500 meters, and famous for its cured ham. Everywhere you go around these parts you find a pig's hind quarters hanging up, pretty gruesome. Anyway, the bus takes nearly an hour to get to Trevelez, and waits there until 4 p.m, when it returns to Granada, passing through Pampaneira. Trevelez has lower, middle and upper areas. The bus drops you in the lower area. All I could find there, shop-wise, was tourist shops, ham shops and bread shops. On asking if there was any supermarkets I was told no. Damn it, should have researched better. And time was moving on, it was around 1 o'clock by now and shops shut at 2 p.m. for siesta. I decided to walk higher, and in the middle barrio, there was a couple of supermarkets and ferreterias. The supermarkets weren't greatly stocked, so I improvised with my camping provisions. The first ferreteria didn't have any butane, it was more building materials. On asking in the one opposite, the woman said no, we don't have butane. So I went looking for another ferreteria, to no avail. I'd gone high up by now, and was hot and bothered. On my way down I went back into the second ferreteria and hunted around a bit and found they did have butane. I was happy and annoyed at the same time, all the rushing around I'd done and they had it all the time. The sales assistant should learn her products, dumbass. Anyway, shops were shutting, so I found a lovely little restaurant terrace and parked myself down for some lunch. Whilst I was there, two guys stopped for lunch. They were driving one of the cars that map the roads for Google and Apple. We got chatting. Dominic is from Ireland, and Adam is from Spain. He drives, and Dominic is the technical wizard, I think. I had a lazy lunch as I had time to kill, waiting for the bus that left at 4 p.m. I wanted a map of the Sierra Nevada, a proper hiking map. The cheapest of exactly the same map I found was €12. In one shop it was €18. What a rip-off. One thing I noticed on the bus was that I was feeling a little queasy, which ceased once I'd gotten off the bus. That's the first time I'd experienced travel sickness. Yuck, not nice. It was the same on the way back. On Wednesday evening, when I was back in Pampaneira from Trevelez, the waiter reminded me that the hostel, restaurant and bar were closed on Thursday and that I needed to pay for my room and move my bike out of the restaurant. I'm not sure why they didn't let me put my bike in my room in the first place, as that's where I put it for Wednesday night. I left Pampaneira around 8 or 9 Thursday morning. It seems the whole village closes on Thursday and I couldn't get any breakfast. So I set off looking for the Camino to Bubion. After half an hour I was high above Pampaneira, but I couldn't find the Camino. I decided I wasn't going to waste any more time looking for it, and started to descend through the village to take the surfaced road. On my way down I found the Camino, which was in fact a narrow mule trail. I'd earlier asked a guy where the Camino was but couldn't follow his directions. He had said I shouldn't take the Camino with a bike, and that it was muy complicado. And he wasn't kidding. The first few hundred meters are overgrown with huge thistles on one side, with a very narrow pathway that had a 3-meter sheer drop on the other. Once past the overgrown part it was clear this was going to be hard work. It was single track, steep and rocky. These mule and goat trails have stones set into the soil on their end, so they stick upwards, not flat like cobblestones. It was such hard work, it took every ounce of my energy to push my way forward. At one point I was ready to turn back, it was that difficult. So very steep. And the fact that my trainers had no tread left didn't help with getting traction to push the bike up over large rocks. At one point I heard myself saying out loud, "You've got this fuck face," willing myself on. It was just so very hard, especially with no calories inside me and the sun rising in the sky. On reaching the top, boy was I relieved. Did I mention it was hard work? Perhaps not to walk it but to push a 40-plus kilo bike up that mule trail. It took everything I had. As I rested at the top of this trail, at the start of the pueblo of Bubion, I noticed a large dog, that I thought was a Great Dane, laying on a dog bed in the pretty tended garden. I said hello to it. And from behind a rose bush in an upper-class English accent a lady said hello. The lady was Temahoa, Tem for short. She couldn't believe I had pushed a bike up the mule trail. We got talking. Tem offered to make me a coffee. First I said no, as I wanted to get on, but then changed my mind and said I'd like a coffee if it was still on offer. I wanted to stay and talk to her. She was very interesting. Born in Tahiti, Tem was an artist, specializing in prints that she displayed in a gallery in Maryland, USA. Tem had lived in Spain many years ago, then spent 30 years living in the USA, returning to the Alpujarras around 3 years ago. She has a Pekingese dog and the big dog, that turns out to be a Boxer Doberman cross, not a Great Dane. He was a big boy. I mentioned the Alpujarras, that's what this region is called. It covers the southern slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Las Alpujarras is a historic part of Spain. Evidence of ancient civilizations has been found in the area. And in more recent times it is thought to have been invaded by the Romans, the Berbers arriving around 1,500 years ago, bringing the evident North African influence to the area. Throughout the centuries it has gone through several changes in the ethnic origins of its inhabitants. Around 500 years ago, when Spain was predominantly under Muslim rule, the Moors were forced to retreat to the hills after conflict with the Christians. It had also suffered but wasn't conquered, during the Civil War and the Franco era. These conflicts had until recently left Las Alpujarras more a backwater place to live. In recent years the Spanish youngsters have opted to move to the happening cities, leaving many buildings uninhabited and falling into disrepair. We always want what we haven't got. The Spanish moved out to the cities. The city dwellers of other European nations have moved into the older worldy Alpujarras for a slower pace of life. Very recently Las Alpujarras has had somewhat of a revival at the hands of the foreigners that have moved in. Attracted by village life or the hectares of land coming with the rural properties, the area has become a melting pot of British, German, Dutch, French and Spanish. Having reconstructed ruins and renovated dilapidated buildings, it has made quite a diverse community, and has brought some modernity and prosperity to the area. It is a place that has captured my heart, and had I the choice, I would see out my days there. As we were talking, a group of mountain bikers headed down the mule trail that I'd just come up. Tem wasn't too impressed with them tearing around, but the guy that runs the mountain bike holidays is her neighbor, and he stopped by to say hello. I could have spent days talking to Tem, she was great company. And it turns out I know of her daughter, Dallas Love, who is a famous horsewoman in the Alpujarras. She runs a horse riding holiday business, not like pony trekking. This is for very experienced riders, to ride the Sierra Nevada mountains. Small world. Tem gave me her web address. Alas, I must have written it down incorrectly as I can't get it to work. I spent around an hour or so with Tem, then pushed up to the top of Bubion, heading towards Capoeira. There was a camino between the two villages, but it was very short and I wanted some breakfast, so I took the surfaced mountain road. I knew there was a bike shop in Bubion, so whilst having some breakfast in a bar, I gave them a call and arranged to pop in and have some new brake pads fitted to bay. I'd been running out of brakes on steep descents, and also I think they'd been binding a bit. After breakfast I stopped at Alpujarra Bikes, where Brian tended to bay, and me and his wife Lynn had a chat and drank tea. It was a useful chat, as she'd warned me that the camino from Capoeira to Trevelez had a washout, where the camino had fallen down the mountainside, so there would be a difficult part to traverse. It's a fab bike shop they've set up in Bubion. Right on the main road with big signage, so not difficult to find. They carry out repairs, hire out and sell bikes, and have a well-stocked shop with lots of exciting bike goodies to peruse. They've been going for years now. I hope they go from strength to strength. Brian changed my brake pads and let me have the part-worn ones in case of emergency, as they were only half to 3/4 worn. He also cleaned and tinkered with my gears, informing me my derailleur bracket is bent, which I knew, as I had bent it back as best I could a few weeks before after bashing it in the mud at El Churro. I couldn't afford a new bracket, so Brian did his best with the gears and lubed the chain. I said my goodbyes at Alpujarra Bikes, then made my way to Capoeira, where I couldn't resist stopping for a Coca-Cola, which came with some delicious free tapas. I also ordered a bocadillo to take with me for later, which was a bit crappy. I'd asked for cheese and tomato, but the tomato was some type of tomatoey paste, yuck. There was a large group of French hikers at the restaurant. I'd seen a lot of French holiday makers since Pampaneira. This area of Spain seems popular with the French. I rode through Capoeira, onto the at first surfaced camino. Of course, it was uphill, what else? After all, I was heading for Trevelez. It wasn't too steep. I rode some, I pushed some. The terrain at times is olive grove, then becomes forested mountainside, and the camino becomes gravel. With ever-increasing scenic mountain views. Not to say it hasn't been scenic since getting to the Sierra Nevada, as it is all beautiful. At this time of year, the wildflowers and the gardens are in bloom and the mountains are green. If you've only visited the costas or the cities of Spain, try and find time to visit the Sierra Nevada, to see a slower, more traditional way of life. So funny, I was taking a squat behind a bush, when who should come along? Dominic and Adam in the map scanning car. I could clearly see them, so I'm hoping I'll be on Apple Maps taking a squat, sometime soon. I stopped around 2 p.m. to eat my bocadillo and have a break. Just after starting walking again, a van drew up the side of me. It was Mike, that runs Switchback mountain bike holidays that I'd spoken to at Thames. He was shuttling his clients up the hill, for them to ride down. He just checked I was okay and waited at the top for me so he could point out the way to go as the road forked just after his drop-off point. His clients were having a fabulous time on their bikes and enjoying their holiday. Mike's guys had some climbing to do before their downhill ride, and we all set off together and it inspired me to get pedaling up the hill. I got way out in front, so I could stop and film them. Alas, I did something I hadn't done for a while, which is turn my GoPro off, instead of on. So I didn't get the footage I had intended. The guys went on their way, and I pushed again, up the Camino. Perhaps an hour or so later, just before the highest point of the Camino, I stopped by an acequia, the water tumbling down the mountain into this man-made catchment. It's good to see that the Alpujarra land will be provided for. Flies. Flies had been a problem the last few days when traveling slowly. They would congregate around my sweaty head and face. Eventually you stop shushing them away and just put up with it. But now the descent, the flies can't stay on you when at speed. So double fun. Some forestry work had recently been done, with gigantic log piles lining the route. I savored the wonderful aroma of fresh sawn timber and pine. There were cattle grazing the land, so a couple of gates to open and close, one of which nearly had me fail the initiative test. I couldn't at first see how to untie it. Riding on, I came to a pretty waterfall to my left, so I stopped to cool down and rest in the shade. I filtered some water too. This is when I noticed some cow poo in the mountain stream, which made me realize I should always filter my water, no matter where I'm getting it. Continuing on down the Camino, the gravel starts to peter out and become grassy, then narrows. This leads to a washout, with a very dry and loose dusty steep descent down, then a steep ascent up. Basically, the Camino has fallen down the mountain, and you have to negotiate what is left. I teetered around the top, trying to get a good foothold on the rocky dusty surface, but kept sliding down. It was so steep I couldn't keep the rear of the bike from rising up, trying to overtake the front. I hadn't gone anywhere yet. I just kept sliding on the dust. The dust was the best part of the trail, with shale to one side and larger loose rocks to the other. I thought I'll turn the bike sideways and put it in front of me, this may work. Before I attempted it, two hikers appeared. What luck, as Sophie, from Belgium, offered to help me down. We eased the bike down. Still I couldn't get a foothold with no tread on my shoes, but having Sophie at the rear, supporting the bike, made it possible. Still it took us some time. Sophie's friend started making her way up the other side of the washout, so I said to Sophie that I'd be okay getting up on my own, so she went off with her friend. Little did I know, the ascent was just as difficult, if not more so, than the descent. Not being able to get traction meant I was struggling to push the weight of the bike over rocks. This side was rockier than the other. I was struggling. And bless her, Sophie returned to help me. It was so hard, even with two of us. And unfortunately, she broke her bracelet whilst pushing up. I hope she managed to repair it. I was so very thankful to her. What a super kind lady. We walked together for a short while, then the ladies walked along the tree line so as to get out of the blazing sun, and I rode off. The Camino ran for a while longer in the forested area, then it narrowed slightly, winding its way onto the lower cultivated hills and small holdings above Trevelez. It was around 6 p.m. by now, the sun less fierce. I was so pleased to meet another bikepacker, Jack from London, coming from the Trevelez direction. We stopped to chat and for photos. Jack took a great one of me. It's rarely I get a photo taken. I was so very pleased when he sent me it. Jack has been riding for 5 days. He's riding the Trans-Andalus route, starting in Granada. It circumnavigates the Sierra Nevada in a clockwise direction. Being in Trevelez, he's done well as he's 3/4 of the way around. He's young, and looks strong. Oh, how I wish I had the power and stamina to ride like him. It was a steep hill I was descending. He was riding up, not pushing like I would be. It's good to meet people that have just ridden where you are going, like with Robert and Meta, as they can pass on information that is helpful to you. I warned Jack about the washout he was going to encounter a few kilometers up. And he informed me of the fork in the road to the upper, middle and lower barrio of Trevelez. Jack was to Wild Camp on the Sierra that night. After our meeting I soon found the road, making my way to Camping Trevelez. Alas, this took around an hour simply because where Google Maps says it is incorrect. I was up and down the road at least 4 times before I flagged a motorhome down, asking where the campsite was. It's around another 100 to 200 meters farther than shown on the map. I'd ridden around 25 kilometers this day, and although hot, I hadn't cooked myself for once. It was around 7:30 when I checked myself in. Camping Trevelez caters for tents, caravans, campervans, and RVs. Built on the mountainside, looking down onto Trevelez to the left and directly across to the next mountain, knowing it was the one I was to climb next. The lady in the office was helpful. I checked in for 2 nights and paid for electricity. It was around €30 all told. It was a steep climb up to the tent area. In fact, everywhere was a steep climb. I bumped into the couple, from I think Germany, that I had flagged down earlier, a few times. They were also staying there. The man spoke some English, so we had a few little chats. There was only one other tent in the tent area, so I decided I'd give them space and pitch at the other end, but after getting all my stuff up there, I decided they had chosen the better area, with no bushes obscuring the view of the mountain opposite. So, I decided to pitch nearer them, still 20 meters away mind. They were a young German couple. We exchanged pleasantries and discussed our tours. They spoke excellent English. It always amazes me just how well non-native English speakers have such a good grasp of the language. I feel quite ignorant that I know no German. The campsite has the usual facilities: showers, toilets, drinking water, wash-up area, clothes washing area, etc. Also, this site has a restaurant and bar which opens at 7:30 in the evening. The Wi-Fi is in the area of the restaurant only. I absolutely love getting to a proper campsite. I don't dislike wild camping and I'm not scared of it, but it's very stressful selecting a spot where you won't get moved on, harassed, disturbed, soaked, eaten by mozzies or blown away. I'd soon set up camp and had me some dinner and lots of tea. The sun hadn't gone down yet. There was a few flies and mozzies around, so I lit a myrrh incense stick inside my vestibule. This did seem to keep them away, but I think it will only work in an enclosed area, unless you have a giant stick. Unfortunately, I burnt a small hole in my tent with it, when I forgot it was there. I really shouldn't have gone to sleep so early. At 9 p.m., as I was awake again at around 1 a.m., I decided to make a cup of tea and have some more food. When it's a clear night, the Sierra Nevada has full-on Milky Way night skies. It wasn't such a night, but still there was more stars than I would see at home and it was quite beautiful. The sun rose over the mountain directly opposite, giving an early blanket of warmth. No waiting here. I love to have a lazy day at camp. It really is a treat. There's nothing like it. I spent the first few hours washing my clothes, taking a shower and pottering around. And charging my electronics. Even though I'd paid for electricity, there isn't actually any sockets in the tent area, so I was having to leave all my expensive gear down in the RV area, charging. It was beautifully sunny, so I used my solar charger to charge my power packs. The site owner allowed me to sit in the restaurant and use the power socket so I could do some YouTube editing on my laptop. I ended up being there from around 11 a.m. until 18:30. When I left I checked with him that the restaurant opened at 7:30. He confirmed, so I took my gear back to my tent. On the way I got waylaid for 3/4 of an hour, chatting to a lady that had been working at the site. Her name was Ghazala, from London, widely travelled and very interesting, I'm guessing in her late 20s. She had been working at Camping Trevelez for 2.5 weeks, placed with Workaway, similar to HelpX, where you work for your accommodation and food. The next day she was leaving for another job, this one on a farm in the Tabernas Desert, northeast of Trevelez. We had a fabulous chat. She needed to get her gear packed up, ready for an early morning leave at 6:30. It would take her many bus rides to get to the Tabernas, over a day's traveling, staying overnight, I think in Granada. I needed to get down to the restaurant for dinner. I was so looking forward to some proper non-camp food. I returned my laptop to my tent and had a quick cup of tea. So sweet of her, Ghazala walked all the way up to my tent, with the food she couldn't take with her. Sadly it was no use to me either, since I couldn't be carrying heavy vegetables on my bike and I didn't want to be cooking at camp, as I was going to the restaurant for food, or so I thought. Unfortunately, when I got down to the restaurant, it was packed. There was a table of 15 rock climbers and 3 other tables of 2 occupied too. I sat at the only spare table, and waited half an hour or so, but realized, with the 15 only just having starters, that I wouldn't get food until around 10 p.m. Ghazala had been called on to waitress, as was the owner, with a chef, possibly his wife, in the kitchen. I needed to pay for a bocadillo I'd had earlier in the day, so Ghazala sorted that out for me and I returned to my tent with my tail between my legs, having 2 packets of noodles for dinner instead. I was pretty pissed that the owner hadn't warned me to get down there early as he had a table of 15 in, but hey, shit happens, doesn't it? It was another starry night sky, this, day 52 of my tour, Friday the 10th of May. On the Saturday morning both me and the Germans were packing up our tents, them flying back to Germany later that day, me on to Two.Pampaneira. I hope the Germans got a ride, they were hitching a ride to catch the bus in Orgiva. I left camping Eight.Trevelez around 10 a.m., with no camp food left, as I'd eaten it all the night before. I needed to go into the town to resupply. Also, whilst in the town, I returned to the nice restaurant I'd eaten at on Wednesday, for some breakfast. Luckily this wasn't a detour, the route rode through the town, then out over Eight.Trevelez, where I took the opportunity to take a photo of Bay at the Eight.Trevelez signpost, as I had done exactly 4 years before with my other bike Stumpy, when I was holidaying over there. It wasn't far after the Eight.Trevelez that I turned onto the Camino, which immediately became evident it was another painful mule trail. I'd spoken to Robert about the ride from here. He said that from Trevelez it was half an hour push-up then down to Two.Pampaneira. Alas, this was not the case, well not for my level of riding anyway, it was a very very long mule trail. Not as steep as the Bubion one, except in odd places, but very long, nearly all uphill and at times overgrown. The terrain varied from very rocky and steep, to meadow with grazing cattle, to mountain springs wetting the soil making it a slippery uphill push, to an overgrown tunnel of brambles. And cow shit. Lots of cow shit. Big pats in the middle of the narrow trail, so hard to avoid, this continued all along it. But always it was fantastic views across the Sierra. Over 2 hours I was pushing up, interspersed with a few rideable sections. I wouldn't have minded except that I was expecting it to be half an hour. So I was continually feeling it'll be going downhill round the next bend, but it didn't for an age. Eventually I hit the Camino, where there was a fantastic view to my right, over to the Contraviesa, basically the view from the Sierra Nevada, down towards the Mediterranean, as the crow flies around 20 kilometers away. It wasn't immediately a downhill ride on the Camino, perhaps a kilometer or 2 in it started to descend. I got so carried away with the fast descent, that I hadn't realized that I'd passed a hidden turn onto a single track 2 kilometers back, that I should have taken. There was no shade now as there had been earlier, the sun was blazing down on me and I needed to push back uphill for 2 kilometers. This took me an hour or so. I was pretty annoyed with myself, in fact it's the first time I was really angry about my stupidity. I was again, overheating, there was no shade at all. Worst of all, I was on a deadline to meet someone. On reaching the single track, literally a random right turn off the Camino, quite inconspicuous, I'm not surprised I missed it. Anyway that's no excuse really, I must look at the map more. This was worth waiting for though, many kilometers of downhill, twisty, sometimes rocky, sometimes overgrown single track. A fabulous ride. The single track eventually hits a narrow Camino that steeply runs down to the main mountain road. And on hitting this road is where I have deviated from the Altravesur. I'm desperately in need of new trainers, not only do they not have any tread left, my toes are hitting the front of the shoe, either my feet have grown, or the trainers have shrunk. So the previous day I'd called my friend Richard, that lives a couple of villages on, to ask if it was possible he could give me a lift to a major town to buy some trainers. Richard's from the UK, but has lived in Alcutar, on and off for over 10 years. He was the kind gent that had given me a lift to or from the airport a few times over the years. He has a parcel of land and is growing a crop of peas currently. On the telephone he explained that he was very busy with his crop so couldn't take a day out, but said if I'd help with his pea crop he would see I get my shoes. So we agreed I'd make my way to his and we could discuss the details. It took me some time, as it was around 4 p.m. with the sun still high, pushing up a shadeless surfaced mountain road under the relentless sun for perhaps an hour and a half. I made my way, riding and pushing, from Juviles to Berchules, stopping off at Hotel Los Berchules for a desperately needed Coke. It had been a long, hot, hard day. And it was so great to see Wendy and Alejandro, that run the hotel, with Alejandro's wife Sheila. It would have been an easy ride to Richard's from the hotel, it's all downhill, from Berchules to Alcutar, but we had spoken on the phone whilst I was at the hotel and agreed he would come up there. Again I was suffering from the effects of too much sun. Rich had an errand to run, high on the Sierra, so I bundled my luggage into his Land Rover, leaving Bay at the hotel, and we set off high up above Berchules on the mountain. This will be the route I need to ride next. But for now I'm stopping in Alcutar. We agreed that for accommodation and food, I would help with the pea picking. Rich found a beautiful cortico Cairo, for me to live in. It's at the other end of the village to his small holding, but only a 15-minute walk away. Cortico Cairo has been reformed, to a unique and high spec, by friends of Richard's, Peter and Teresa. The large cortico sits on an elevated outcrop on the outskirts of the pueblo, with fantastic views of the valley dropping to Calahorra, then further views to the Sierra de Luja. Living in the UK, Peter and Teresa use it as their Alpujarras holiday retreat. Very kindly, they agreed to let me stay here. I find people's kindness quite amazing, letting a complete stranger live in their beautifully renovated and furnished home, that they quite obviously love. So I thank them very much. One thing you get used to in the Alpujarras is stray cats. Last time I was here I ended up feeding around 12 to 15 of them. It's no different at Cortico Cairo, within hours of being here the cats called around. Luckily, as funds are low, there's only 5 of them. Gold Digger, Annabelle, Mogadishu, Moon, and Stumpy. The cats are quite manageable, but there's a local farmer's dog that waits at the Cortico door for me, night and day. She's lovely, but a complete pig, and I'm having trouble feeding the cats as she just slithers along the ground and plants her head in every bowl, clearing them in seconds. I've named her Hoover. She really is such a kind-mannered soul, but very stupid. She can't follow any instructions and just jumps up at me all the time, which I love except for the fact she is covered in ticks and God knows what else. Very much. After Rich ran his errand, we returned to his small holding, where we chatted, then Rich cooked a most welcome dinner. I'm not sure Rich had realized how knackered I was that Saturday evening. I was desperate to get to sleep but didn't get to the Cortico until nearly 11 p.m, so to bed around midnight. Worse still, he wanted me on the farm the next morning to start work. I arrived around 9 a.m, and spent the day weeding around the peas. It seemed a bit of a pointless task as the peas were nearly ready for their first harvest, a little horse-bolted stable door jobby. I think I was doing it wrong anyway. I was being far too conscientious, I realized later. Anyway, I was weeding that very hot day, until 8 p.m. It was tough, and I was totally knackered. Rich had said make myself at home in his house, so when I was tired, I made myself a cup of tea, perhaps 2 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. With a 2-hour lunch break from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m, when the sun is at its hottest, Rich cooks a fantastic lunch. I really enjoy that part of the day. The next day I arrived at 8 a.m. and worked, weeding again, until 6 p.m. This weeding is putting a strain on my right shoulder that I injured a few weeks before. I took to cutting the 3-feet-high weeds down as they were too hard to pull up. At 6 p.m. we took a ride out in the Land Rover to EBIII to pick up the pea crates from the market, as the next day, Tuesday, we would start picking. That was a tough day too, from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., bent over, in the blazing sun, with around a total of 3 hours of breaks. It's not as brainless as it seems. You need to make a judgment. Is the pea ready to pick? Is it nearly ready to pick but will go overripe before the next pick? I found it a little stressful as I didn't want to reduce the market value of his peas by doing it wrong. I was so happy when Rich gave me the day off Wednesday and Thursday. Heaven. Time to recuperate, and finding time to catch up with Jenny from Pure Mountains and Wendy, Alejandro and Scylla at the hotel. And to chill TF out. Also, you need 2 hands to pick the peas. Each time I detached a pod it gave a little tug on my dodgy shoulder, so down days gave my shoulder a little rest. And so we got into a 2 days on picking, then 2 days off rhythm, which suited me well. In fact, on day 2 of the pick, I'm pretty bloody useless, as I'm so tired. We've been averaging 100 kilograms of peas picked per day, with I'd say Rich picking say 10 to 20 kilograms more than me. So that's me for a few weeks. I'm writing this 2 weeks on from arriving, day 67 of my tour, Saturday the 25th of May, and this day I'm on day 3 of 4 consecutive days off. Love it. But back to picking Monday. I'm thinking I'll probably do 2 more weeks, when the main pea harvest will be over, then get back on the Altravesur. It's a shame I'm not riding now, as the last 4 days have been cloudy and cooler. You can bet by the time I'm on the mountain, it'll be blazing sunshine. During my last 2 weeks in Alcutar the pea picking was quite sporadic, giving me many free days to prep bay ready for returning to the route. I repaired a slow puncture on the front tire by removing many thorns, letting the tire down and pumping in more sealant. A good wash, lube and spanner check, plus removal of the Gorilla cage mounts and refitting them with new tape and cable ties. They'd taken a good few hits riding through brush and had turned slightly on the fork. You may wonder why I don't talk about all the repairs I have to do to my bike. Well, the reason for that is I haven't had to do any except preventative maintenance. Specialized bikes are expensive, but they are built from high-end components and designed so very well. The days off also gave me time to do shopping and prepare myself mentally for the return to being alone in the mountains again. I was enjoying my time in Alcutar. Life was easy and safe. The thought of returning to the Altravesur was quite daunting, especially as the weather was heating up, now in the high 20s. But cabin fever was setting in. I was ready to go. Not that I was bored, I just couldn't afford to do anything very exciting. I didn't have the hiking gear to tackle say a climb up Mulhacén, and I didn't want to ride bay as the tires had taken a good bashing on the route so far, and I was keen not to have the expense of buying new ones. 12 years ago, I had met Di and Robin in the Alpujarras. They had renovated a lovely house in Alcutar. At some point they had returned to their hometown in Scotland, visiting their Alpujarra haven only occasionally. Luckily Di and her mother Edith had taken a short break in Alcutar whilst I was there, so we managed to fit in a quick catch-up, which was fab. I also arranged to meet up with Amanda and Andy, the couple I had stayed with the August prior, in the Alpujarras for 2 weeks, helping with their horses. We were to meet in Calahorra, a town lower down the mountains. I hiked down from Alcutar on a beautiful Saturday morning. A short way into the hike, I met a lady, Antonia, that was taking a morning stroll. With my little Spanish, we struck up a conversation and walked together. Antonia grew up in Calahorra, but now lives on the coast in El Ejido near Almería. It is common for the Spanish to move away from their hometown but retain a residence there, returning to it for fiestas and the hot and busy coastal summer. Left to my own devices I would have hiked alongside the dry riverbed into Calahorra, but Antonia, being a local, knew a much prettier route along the acequia. We had a lovely walk, chatting as best we could, teetering on the bank of the acequia, as we walked. Occasionally hopping over it at junctions, we passed by a beautifully restored mill, some pretty mountain scenery, and Antonia's husband Geraldo, tending the land they still have. On reaching Calahorra, we stopped and had refreshments on the terrace of a cafe and chatted some more. Antonia loved the Gerald Brennan book entitled South from Granada, a book that I managed to read whilst in Alcutar. She adores the Alpujarras, and this book is the reflections of Gerald Brennan, an Englishman, that lived in the Alpujarras village of Yeccan, after getting demobbed from the army in the 1920s. After swapping Facebook contact details, we went our separate ways, both needing to do some shopping. I was keen to buy something to cover up the gap between my shirt sleeve and my gloves whilst riding, as my wrists had got quite sunburnt during the previous rides. I also needed some camp food and some more incense sticks. Things like this can be found in the Chinese bazaar-type shops, of which most pueblos have at least one. It was nice to be able to take my time shopping. Rich had taken me out shopping a few times, but there wasn't time to browse, which is what I needed to do. Although on one outing I did manage to get to the only shoe shop in Cadia to buy some new trainers. I had to get ones 2 sizes bigger than I normally wear. I managed to find some cheap wrist supports, not quite what I was looking for, but as it turns out, very fortunate I did. And I found the other things I was looking for. I got a lovely surprise when I met up with Andy and Amanda for lunch, as they'd brought along Tina, another lady I'd met whilst working with Amanda. We had a chilled afternoon, eating and chatting, under the shade of umbrellas on the terrace. I had such a wonderful day, meeting friends, and making a new one in Antonia. Strolling home in the late afternoon sun, uphill, back to Alcutar was just perfect. The previous night, whilst in bed I heard a few scampering noises in the cortico. I thought it must be mice, but when I arrived home from my fabulous Saturday out I spotted a gecko in the house. It took some catching, I can tell you. Cortico Cairo doesn't have Wi-Fi. Spending so much free time there, with no techie distractions, gave me the opportunity to read some of the many books that are at the house. I again read Driving Over Lemons by Chris Stewart, and, for a first time, South from Granada by Gerard Brennan and Ghosts of Spain by Gilles Tremlett. The first 2 of these 3 books are wholly pertinent to the Alpujarras. The third touches on the Alpujarras as it was where the deposed Muslim leader of Granada was banished several hundred years ago. All such good reads if you're interested in Spain. I also watched the film El Cid de Granada, the film based on the Gerald Brennan book. For me, it was so much better than the book, as the storyline includes his love affair with a Spanish lady. It didn't really make him look very honorable, to be honest, and it's a sad tale. Many years ago, I had read the Motorcycle Diaries by Che Guevara. At Cortico Cairo I read the book Traveling with Che Guevara, The Making of a Revolutionary, written by Alberto Granado, Che's companion on the motorcycle ride. This book gave a good insight as to why Che became an activist. He was enraged at the treatment of the poorer people of South America, by foreign capitalists such as those of the US. It was such a shame that he chose to make change by force, as I think he would have made a great statesman, being so charismatic. But I also understand that the foreign industrialists were foreign government supported and it would have been a dirty fight. Che, supposedly, desperately wanted to take the revolution to the rest of South America after conquering Cuba with Fidel Castro. My personal belief is that he was set up by the US or Fidel Castro or Russia, or a combination of those, when he was sent to his death in Bolivia. I really feel he was a humanitarian, and my opinion is that it's propaganda, trying to make us believe he was a brutal murderer, and moreover I believe he was set up, with another contingent raping and murdering innocent civilians, whilst Che got the blame. He was an activist trying to get his fellow South Americans out of poverty. He wasn't a murderer. Sadly, the United States have done a great character assassination on Che, and sullied his memory forever. It would be sad to say goodbye to Rich, but I think he'd had enough of me by now. And I'd be sad to leave the cats and Hoover too. I got quite attached to Hoover, the little shit that she was. And in fact, to again leave this part of the Alpujarras, as this is where I feel I belong. But it was time to think of leaving. Being in Alcutar, I was located equidistant between 2 ways back onto the Altravesur route. Both involved climbing directly up the Sierra Nevada range, then turning right to continue east along the east-west Camino. One of the ways was to return to Jubiles, where I'd left the route. The other was to ride to the next pueblo of Messina Bomberon. I chose the latter. If I returned to Jubiles, the climb up the Sierra above Berchules would have been too tough a day after for weeks off the bike. The climb from Messina Bomberon was going to be slightly easier and I'd only be missing out a few kilometers of the route. I was getting itchy feet into the third week of being in Alcutar and wanted to get moving, but I wanted to stay until Rich could manage the pea picking on his own. It was a little awkward, as I didn't know how to broach the subject, and I think he felt the same. I think he'd had enough of me. I was so glad, if a little surprised, when one evening Rich walked his dogs up to the Cortico and mentioned he didn't think there was enough peas left to bother doing any more picks. I said I was happy to stay until he was sure and that I thought there was at least one more decent pick to do. So we agreed he'd think about it overnight. After checking the crop, we agreed we would do one more pick, the next Monday, day 76 of my tour, the 3rd of June. It had been great helping Rich, in return for him helping me, now and in the past. I'd got my trainers and Rich had his crop picked. We had lots of heated political debates. Lots of lovely meals, cooked by Rich, and he took me out for a great lunch at El Cercado, his neighbor's restaurant. He also gave me €60, that were most welcome. And I got to know him a little. I think he was glad to see the back of me. I think I annoy him. After agreeing I was no longer needed to pea pick, I kept an eye on the El Tiempo weather app, so I could decide when I should make a move. You have to take the forecasts with a pinch of salt in the mountains. There are so many variables, it is difficult to predict the weather. I could see that in a week's time there was a 3-day period of cloud predicted. I was keen to ride in the coolest weather possible, so decided upon leaving on the middle of the 3 days, Sunday the 9th of June. I spent the Friday saying my goodbyes. The Saturday was spent carrying out a thorough clean of Cortico Cairo, tidying the garden and packing as much onto bay that I could. I was up at 5 a.m. Sunday. I finished off the cleaning and set off at 7 a.m. The weather forecast was spot on. There was a heavy mist that morning, with the surrounding mountains swallowed by low cloud. Without the beautiful views, it was so much easier to leave Alcutar. Still I felt sad, as I doubt I'll afford to go back, so it was a final farewell. Once out of the narrow steep streets of Alcutar I turned downhill onto the surfaced road, joining the Camino that would lead to the Altravesur after a couple of kilometers. A steep push to start with, the misty ride was so refreshing, no overheating or punishing sunshine, with surrounding mountains appearing and disappearing as the low cloud blew in and out. It was perfect riding weather. In 2015 I'd ridden up to Cerro Gordo on Stumpy, my blue mountain bike. This ride was heading towards it but bypassing the peak itself and continuing up and east. Looking back and way down, I could see the town of Berchules in the distance, this giving me an idea of how far I'd climbed. My ride was directly up the Sierra Nevada range, heading towards the ridgeline. Once at the top, I joined the Altravesur, the Camino running east along the range. I don't know why I was so worried about returning to the route. I'm a loner and was totally at home as soon as I got on the bike. The solitude, just me, my transport, my food, my water and my shelter, what more could you need? On joining the Altravesur there's a fuente, but it was dry. A little past it there was a spring dribbling water from the mountainside, so I replenished my water from that, only to find another fuente a little farther along, that was flowing well. There was at times beautiful views as I rode along the mountain range. When the clouds separated I could see down the valleys with the distant whitewashed Alpujarra villages nestled on the hillsides. The route took me along and around each hump, riding along one hump then along the hump that had been opposite. I like it when I can see where I've been and where I'm going, makes more sense to me and I can see how the ride is progressing. When I say hump, if you imagine the spine of the Sierra Nevada runs east to west, all the way along the spine at 90 degrees to it, running north to south are the hills that I call humps. I am running along these humps towards the east, approximately 2/3 the way up to the spine. The ascents and descents were mild, just bimbling along the side of the mountains was most enjoyable. I could see small farms on the slopes, now and again a village in the distance. The views were scenic, with many rocky outcrops and forested sections, not a lot of shade, but I hadn't needed it thus far. On this section I experienced a lot of the strange optical illusion, where what looks like a descent, is actually uphill and vice versa. I think I understand it, and it means I need to test every section to see if I want to ride it or not. The dirt Camino was in pretty good condition. Sometimes where it had lacked traffic it would be grassy in the middle. I stopped for food and a rest at a waterfall around 1 p.m, a pretty little spot that had had some effort put into pretty it up for tourists, with some seating surrounding the catchment pool. Mid-afternoon I was feeling tired. Mostly I hadn't slept well in Alcutar, as I hadn't the night before, and I'd been up early. Whilst in Alcutar I'd made a change to how I held my tent on my bike, adding a plastic surround to the tent bag that prevented it squashing down so much by the straps of my front luggage. This also enabled me to get my tarp out of my tent bag, without removing the bag from the bike. So I had my nap on the tarp. Alas, 2 different colonies of ants had the same idea and pestered me all through my nap. Continuing on, the last 2 humps, high above the pueblos of Nechheit, Marina, Hubar and Laurelles were slightly steeper ascents and descents than the previous humps. The area felt very remote. I'd seen perhaps 3 cars on the Camino all day. And none in the past 2 hours. I could hear cow or goat bells in the distance, but not actually see the herd. It's quite a soothing sound, knowing civilization is close by but no humans to pester me. It was very scenic and a lovely ride. The sky was a mix of sunshine and cloud. Now the fog had stopped blowing in and out, staying cool when the sun was shrouded and very hot when not. One thing to note was that after the first couple of humps there wasn't any water replenishment opportunities. All the acequias were dry. If desperate I could have taken some from a water deposit at the farms that were scattered here and there. I'd originally thought this leg of the journey would take me 2 days, but as I was making such good time, I was on target to get over to the northern side of the Sierra Nevada range in 1 day. Alas, I missed a rather inconspicuous turning. I stopped to take stock, have a biscuit and a drink, and to try and establish exactly where I was. I thought I had understood how I needed to get back on the route, and that was by returning 1.5 kilometers uphill. I got around half a kilometer into this return push-up, only to realize I wasn't where I thought I was. This Camino would be 3 kilometers until I was back en route. So stupidly I walked back down the hill to the point where I'd stopped earlier to try and work it out again. I then saw the Camino that would be the shorter, 1.5 kilometer return to the route, but it was steep and very rocky. So I set off back on the 3 kilometer less steep uphill track again. I could see the pueblo of Bikepacking way down in the distance. I was tempted to ride off-route to the town and get a room, but decided against it as it would be a long hike back up to the route in the morning. It was around 7 p.m. by now. The sun just wouldn't stay behind the bloody big clouds, so it was very hot and annoying. I eventually arrived at the turning I missed, which would have been a left fork originally. I had seen it, but as it was steeply uphill and chained off, I didn't even consider it to be part of the route. No matter, I decided to camp for the night right there. There was a large ruin slightly higher up from the Camino. I spent 20 minutes climbing up there, checking it out, but couldn't see a decent flat area to pitch up on, so decided to pitch up in the run out of a rocky gully that was a grassy little clearing. If it had rained, I'd have been in trouble. It was clearly where rain run down the gully. It was reasonably flat, sheltered and quite a pretty spot, with woodland to my left and in front, and mountains to my right with the rocky gully behind. I love it when I've decided upon my camp, looking forward to my first cup of tea of the day and something hot to eat. Unfortunately, there was a ridiculous number of mozzies and flies at this one. The little buggers bit my ankles so much they were bleeding. As soon as the tent was up, I lit a couple of sandalwood incense sticks inside the vestibule of my tent and it cleared the bloody pests quickly. Still, there was no water available, which made me wonder where the mozzies had come from. There must have been some water around here. I'd passed a mountain river several kilometers back, before I got lost, but wasn't going to backtrack, so would have to make do. I was on a slight incline. I thought I'd positioned the tent correctly, with my head at the top of the incline, but on lying down I found I hadn't, so had to sleep with my head at the narrow and junk end of the tent. This didn't pose a problem. I slept from around 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., then had a cuppa and some biscuits, and slept until around 7 a.m. I'm not sure of the altitude I was camping at, but I think it was somewhere around 1600 meters, so there was a lot of wind noise that night. Luckily I was well sheltered and could only hear it. I'd traveled around 45 kilometers this day, and although the sun was hot in the evening, it hadn't cooked me, so I was well pleased at feeling on good form. On waking, the sun had risen and was lighting up the mountain to my right, but my camp was still in the shade. It was chilly, even with gloves on. I packed up camp quickly and returned to the route, taking the turning I'd missed the night before, which climbed higher up this hump. It felt very remote up here. The Camino was chained off to motorized traffic. The only tracks on the mostly grassed-over Camino were those of mountain bike tires, goats and cows. I wondered if any of the bike tracks were those of Robert and Meta, that had ridden the Altravesur a few weeks previous. There was woodland to both my left and right. Right was down the mountain, left up it. Many trees had been blown down, a couple were across the Camino. With the loud wind the night before, I wasn't surprised. Being left to only walkers and cyclists, this Camino had a very special feel to it. The flora and fauna were flourishing with many butterflies, moths and beautiful wildflowers. After a few kilometers there were many mountain springs, so plenty of water to filter as I was just about out after using a lot at camp. It seemed such a waste, many of the springs running down the Camino, and it was sodden in places. Such a shame no efforts being put into harnessing it, as farther back on the Camino there is no water. I was at around 1,800 meters altitude by now. The amount of cow poo on the Camino increased as I progressed on up. It made me wonder where the cows were. The poo was often quite recently deposited. I could only see one farm, way down the Sierra, but no cows or goats. Eventually getting to what I believe is the highest point of the Altravesur, just over 2,100 meters, where there was an ideal photo opportunity at a rocky outcrop at that point. I'd never been to the mid-east end of the Sierra Nevada, only the west and middle mountains. I think this was my favorite. It was vast and less populated, with the feeling of wilderness that I like, to a degree. Way down below in the distance I could see a surfaced road. I think it was the mountain pass road that cuts through from the southern Sierra Nevada to the north. It looked rarely used. I only saw one vehicle on it. Seeing that, I knew I was close to the crossing point myself. The Camino rose up from that point perhaps another 50 meters or so, then came the descent taking me to Puerta de la Ragua, the mountain pass I was taking to cross the range from the southern slopes to the northern slopes. The descent wasn't as long or steep as I thought it would be. It made sense a little later why that was. There was more descent to come. The Camino exits the southern Sierra Nevada, hitting the mountain pass surfaced road, at 2,000 meters elevation. At the Puerta de la Ragua pass I found what looks like a cafe or information center. It was closed. I turned left onto the road, downhill for a kilometer or so, then the route called for a sharp right turn. I couldn't figure it out and overshot it by a short way. The surfaced road was high and steeply downhill, with barriers alongside. I walked back uphill a way and saw that the turning was a single track which was well hidden between the roadside armco. Now was descent time. This single track was steep, rocky, twisty and overgrown, scary at times. Hard to follow too. A new firebreak was being cut by a digger, which threw me off the trail for a while. This ride down the northern side of the Sierra Nevada was such fun, but hard on the bike as it was just so rocky. Then it became overgrown. At first with long grasses and shrubs, then tunnels of brambles and stinging nettles. These brambly tunnels went on for some time. Whilst riding one, I dodged some stinging nettles, got a bit of a wobble on, went to dab with my right foot, but nothing was there. It was a 20-foot drop down to a creek. Me and Bay fell sideways down the brambly embankment, luckily stopped halfway down by a sturdy tree. With all the weight on Bay, he fell hard, catching the tree with a hefty thud, between the forks and down tube. I landed heavily on my right hip and bashed my head quite hard. I don't think I lost consciousness, so wasn't too worried about the head hit, but was so glad I had my helmet on. I had quite a few scratches and was a bit shaken, but no serious damage luckily, and so very glad I had worn the wrist supports I'd bought in Cadir. The worst part came when I tried to get Bay back up the embankment. The embankment was steep, but worse, it had a water spring at the top. so all the soil was sodden. I could barely stand on the embankment due to having no traction on the steep slippery mud, and as hard as I tried, I couldn't get Bay upright. I was so worried. My phone had survived the fall but there was no signal, and by how overgrown the trail was, I knew it was unlikely that anyone would be around to help. I decided to remove the front and rear luggage from Bay. This was quite difficult. Getting the removed luggage up the embankment, onto the trail was worse. It was so slippery I just couldn't get up. I found a branch of a small tree to pull myself up with. After 4 trips to the top I started pulling the much lighter Bay up. It was so difficult getting the traction to push him up. Eventually I resorted to pulling him up through the brambles. It was such a relief when everything was back up onto the trail. There was nowhere to stand Bay on the bramble-lined trail, so I pushed him around 30 meters down the trail and leant him against a wall. I reloaded Bay, then went down to the creek to wash the mud off me and to clean all the scratches. I realized after, if I'd have walked along the creek with Bay, I could have got up a less steep embankment. But still I would have had to remove all the luggage as I couldn't extract him from around the tree. My legs stung where I'd got scratched up on the brambles and stung by the nettles. All this palaver took around an hour or so. Seriously, I shouldn't be allowed out alone. Then I set off on my way. Luckily Bay sustained no damage. I still had all my gears, the tires were fine as were the brakes. How lucky. I had no serious damage, but did feel a little weird, which didn't hinder my riding. Continuing on, it was around another half kilometer of brambles, then there was a decent camino which I sped down at top speed, leading into the sleepy pueblo of Ferreira. I still don't know how to pronounce it. It was around 3 p.m., so siesta time, but I didn't even see any cafes or restaurants, so I continued on through and headed into the dry hot plateau leading to La Calahorra. And it was hot, with the sun at its highest and zero shade. The terrain on this side of the Sierra Nevada was so very different to the other side, where it's still green and lush mostly. This side was desert-like, dry and barren. It wasn't a long ride on the surfaced road before I saw a beautiful castle upon a hill. This was situated in La Calahorra. I soon found a bar open, Bar Restaurant Rosabelle. I stopped off for a Coke at this rather trendy-looking bar and asked if they did rooms. It was also a hostel, I learnt. I wasn't planning on stopping here, but after my accident, I wasn't feeling 100%, so I took a room for 2 nights, that would give me enough time to wash my muddy clothes. La Calahorra was another beautiful whitewash mountain town, but this one didn't look as though it had been invaded by foreigners. There were many dilapidated houses in need of restoration, and it didn't look as touristy or as wealthy as say the villages in the Alpujarras. The Bar Rosabelle had been remodeled by the current owners, Paula and Sam, a young married couple, expecting their first child in October. They had been running it a year. They'd made a fab job of the renovation, even making the furniture themselves, for the bar and restaurant, which was a designer twist on traditional Spanish, making a modern and airy space. They've not renovated the adjoining hostel yet, but it's fine in its current form. I'm so excited for them. They are such nice people and were very welcoming and helpful to me. Sam connected the hosepipe out in the street, so I could wash the mud off Bay and the luggage. And they let me store him in the large hostel reception. From my room I could see the castle, the beautiful church and another building, just opposite, that I never found out its history, but it was beautiful. Perhaps an old monastery? I've no idea. I didn't visit the castle, it's not a ruin, so would have loved to, but it's only open on Wednesdays. I'd woken early Tuesday morning, and was happy that after my accident the day before, I only had a few aches and pains, shoulder, hip, wrist and ankle, but none were debilitating. I was so glad I had the sunburn-preventing wrist supports on. I spent Tuesday doing some shopping and looking around the town. I was looking at the outside of the impressive church and an old lady said I could go in with her to have a look. I didn't stay long as a service was about to start. I was taken aback at just how ornate and richly decorated it was inside, and at how big it was, with a beautiful wooden ceiling, that I learned was lucky to survive the Civil War, as many were burned down. It was a Monday I arrived there, so I was having Monday and Tuesday night in La Calahorra. I washed my clothes, gave Bay a good check over and rested. Barrosabel serves great food. Alas, I often seem to be in a hostel on the day they close, in this case the Tuesday, not opening until midday Wednesday, the day I was leaving. I found another restaurant to have my meals on Tuesday and breakfast Wednesday. Nonetheless, Barrosabel is worth a visit. Paula speaks fluent English, having worked in London for a few years before returning to Spain. I often think of her and wonder how she is, and hope the baby is doing well. And so here I am on the northern side of the Sierra Nevada, all new to me, and I was excited for the next part of the ride, which would be skirting around some desert areas. Bearing that in mind, I was worried what the sun had in store for me. No matter, for now, time to rest. Thank you so much for listening. That's the end of episode 3 of this story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, it would be great if you click the thumbs up button, as it helps the channel so much. If you'd like to ask a question, leave me some advice, or generally chat about the story, please leave a comment below. Episode 4 coming soon, and spoiler alert, that is the last episode.